Hello, and welcome to Happy You Asked, the podcast where we explore joy one awkward conversation at a time. And I'm your host, Erin Clare. Today's guest is Dr. Matthew Johnson. Since 2004, he's played a role in the revival of psychedelic research, publishing on psychedelics in relation to mystical experience, personality change, risk and safety, ethics, and the treatment of tobacco addiction, cancer distress, and depression. In 2021, he received, as principal investigator, the first grant in about 50 years from the US government to administer a classic psychedelic as a treatment. He's also known for his expertise in behavioral economics, addiction, sexual risk behavior, and research across a wide range of drugs. You probably heard him on the Lex Fridman podcast, the Huberman Lab podcast, and 60 Minutes, or read about his work in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, NPR, Fox News, the BBC, and Think Tank, and many others. I am honored that you're here. Welcome to the podcast.
My
Dr.
pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. All first guests, the same question for all first guests. It's the one they hate. What is your definition of happiness?
Um, yeah, that's a that's an interesting question. I think so. Happiness, um, would be uh a current feeling of joy, um, you know, a sense that one would like to uh continue experiencing whatever they're experiencing and kind of somehow put themselves in the situation to have more of that.
Mhm,
I
mhm,
think that's sort of I'm a behaviorist at heart, so kind of something to get it, like
mhm,
you're gonna want to get there again.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
gonna do something to have that whatever one is experiencing to have that positive um, you know, state of being.
Is that the goal of your research, would you say, to help people find happiness?
It's kind of hard to summarize all of it. I guess in some sense, a chunk of my work is helping people with mental health disorders, so addiction, depression, in the past, cancer distress. And you could frame it that way, although you get into the realm of and perhaps it's semantics, but I think there's something there. Um, Sort of contentment versus happiness. And
Mm,
of course,
mhm,
it depends on how you define, how kind of molar you define,
mhm,
happiness. I guess, my take is that part of some of these disorders, really all of them that I've mentioned, um, the goal isn't to be happy all of the time. In fact, that's part of the problem. The expectation that we're supposed to, constantly be happy. And so kind of goals more of like contentment or
mhm.
satisfaction might be closer to the target because, if the goal is to be happy, you can be addicted to cocaine.
Yeah, that's
In the
true.
short
They
term, it
appear very
works.
happy.
Yeah, in the short term, it works. That's the issue.
Yes. Well, can you talk to me about behavioral economics? Our listeners might not know what that is, and how did that behavioral economics and addiction research lead you to psychedelic research?
Yeah, so behavioral economics is at one level the taking the analytic tools that were developed in the economics field, largely microeconomics, over the last 100 years or so, and applying them to understand typically human behavior, but you could apply it to non-human behavior as well. Um, and behavior that doesn't relate to money.
Hmm.
So the same principle. So for example, um, some of my work has understood the role, has tried to understand the role of nicotine in motivation to smoke cigarettes, tobacco, the pharmacological versus non-pharmacological rewarding aspects of smoking. And so you can have someone, and I've done a number of studies like this in the laboratory, essentially working for the ability to smoke a cigarette, and where it kind of differentiates from the classic sort of B.F. Skinner style operant behavioral lens of, I work to get the food pellet, uh, th- it's applying those economic principles. So you can look at things like it's not just will someone work to receive this reward? It's looking at, for example, elasticity. And so elasticity, it's a more nuanced way to look at things in kind of based on the background that it's not just that, something that is rewarding that you always wanted. Organisms, including people, have kind of a set level of motivational preference that's kind of biologically based. I mean, look at food. You're not always hungry. At some point, you're going to say, no, another piece of pizza isn't as rewarding as that first piece. And there's sort of diminishing marginal utility. So the second piece is, less valuable than the first. So that's another economic principle. Elasticity, which I mentioned, is answering this question. Okay, when price goes up, typically consumption, the amount that you purchase or you work for, goes down. But it's sometimes that's sub-proportional to the price increase, and sometimes it's super proportional. And that sounds, too mathy. But basically what that means is, so for example, gasoline is a classic good in the economy, that's used as an example here. We're typically pretty inelastic with gasoline. So um, the price of gasoline could go up by 20%. You'll see some reduction, like maybe you'll drive less, but typically not, you won't see a 20% reduction. You might see a 3% reduction in the amount that you drive or the amount of gas that you buy, even though price has gone up 20%. That's relatively inelastic. Um, and so when you have more luxury goods, they're typically an example, especially at higher prices, of elastic goods. So um, you don't need it. Like if the price of diamonds went up so high, eventually we'd adopt different, practices. And okay, instead of that being the thing for it, to put it in an engagement ring, there's plenty of other stones.
Hmm.
So it's at some point it's going to be, elastic consumption. So you can apply these not just to goods in the economy, but to yeah, how much money or how much work I'm willing to put out in order to earn my next puff of a cigarette.
Yeah.
And then you can look at concepts. Another big thing I've looked at with behavioral economics is this concept of delayed discounting, which is a way of quantifying and studying a common sense. I mean, all of this, has a common sense level, like I just described with elasticity, even if we don't know the terms. Same thing with delayed discounting. All else being equal, pretty much we'd always want something. If you're going to get something good, you'd rather have it sooner rather than later. And there's a flip side to that. If something's bad going to happen, you'd rather it
Hmm.
happen later rather than sooner or now. But people differ wildly by that. So you can quantify this by asking people, would you rather have $100 in a year or $50 now? And
Hmm.
you might take one or the other, but uh, if you say, okay, you'd rather have $100 in a year, okay, what about this question? What about let's make the now option more attractive. How about $75 now? And so, okay, well, um, you know, uh, yeah, I'd rather take it now. So you say, okay, well, what about, something, $60. So you would keep adjusting the point until you find a point of indifference. So you can say, aha, let's say $62 for you is roughly equivalent. $62 now is roughly equivalent to receiving $100 in a year, right? That's your indifference point. That's the decrease in value for you that goes along with delaying something by a year. So now let's ask a series of questions to get at your indifference point for a 1 day delay, a 1 week delay, a 1 month delay, a 5 year. And you can fill out this indifference, this function, this delay discounting curve. And it turns out that when you ask, even when you control your sample of participants for their income and all kinds of things, their intelligence and their education. Turns out if someone's addicted to any number of substance, they tend to have not just a little, but radically steeper discounting curves. In other words, shifting that preference to I'd rather have it now. And so this isn't just seen with things like opioids like heroin or cocaine, but just cigarette smokers. Again, of a similar income. So, people of, say, middle class income, similar education, but those who smoke cigarettes out of that sample would tend to have that more immediate preference, have a steeper delayed discounting curve. So that's, I've argued over the years, is a fundamental behavioral process that's going on in addiction. And that kind of thinking back to how I answered your question, that's kind of informs my way of thinking about things.
Yeah.
Maybe that happiness versus contentment. Um, and at least at the time, what's gonna be valuable. But what's valuable at that time is not always going to be valuable. So it depends on our motivational state. And so another way to kind of express is behavioral economics very much kind of it sees an organism, including the human, and their behavior as a product of the constraints of the environment. So what is available? What are the alternatives available? It's not just what's in front of you, but what are the other options you have available to you? What are the prevailing costs to all of those options? Are there some concurrent punisher? So is there some bad stuff that goes along with getting the good stuff?
Yeah.
And then it gets, complex. Like maybe and this is relevant to addiction, maybe some of the good stuff is more immediate, but it comes with bad stuff down the line. The hangover is tomorrow. The enjoyment from, 3 or 4 drinks is now. How do people differ in how they navigate that? So,
Yeah.
and then behavioral economics, I mean, psychedelics, I mean, I have a history of studying all kinds of drugs. I started out as an undergraduate doing some cocaine research, but and eventually published it. But was learning from the literature, from textbooks about all the psychoactive substances, illegal and legal. So caffeine and alcohol, nicotine to cocaine and opioids, cannabis, and just it was very fascinating to me how these different essentially molecules. I mean, even caffeine, how can you just have a few cups of coffee and then find yourself up all night or getting more work done?
Mhm.
And so I was always fascinated by drugs and behavior. And so that kind of led me to psychedelics when I discovered this kind of older literature with LSD treating people with alcoholism and looking at its effects on the mind. And I differ from a lot of folks that have jumped into the psychedelic research field because I might seem an unlikely candidate with this very kind of behavioral psychology, economically informed perspective. You tend to see more humanistic psychology and an interest in spirituality and things that I've studied and am interested in. But, kind of my first lens, I look at different schools of thought as different lenses, and it's not like
Mhm.
there's one lens available. There's all of these lenses, there's these different tools to use. And you should use as many that are appropriate for the question. But my kind of initial lens is that of a behavioral psychologist, because that's a very real and so a very kind of pervasive mode of way of understanding the world. And
Mhm.
so, a lot of my work with has been with psychedelics and addiction, and it does appear that there's some real anti-addiction potential, and part of that kind of interfaces with the behavioral economics, in the sense that people tend to have come out with bigger picture perspectives on their life and what they're doing and the problems they're having. Um, there seems to be kind of a perspective effect that people
Mhm.
have that changes and ultimately I'm interested in behavior change. And so, psychedelics, not always, but sometimes can have a powerful effect on changing the course of someone's life. And, I'm just always aware there were these anecdotes of, from often from artists, including musicians, that just, these psychedelics really changed in a lasting
Yeah.
way.
Well,
Um,
especially my generation. We all watched The Doors, right?
mhm,
Brian Wilson. So yeah, and there's been lots of talk about it. And
mhm,
what's fascinating is thinking about it from this perspective of just seeing things differently, even from their bigger lens, and especially when you think about uh, uh, certain types of mental illnesses and addictions as being very closed, where you can't see anything but the next moment, like you were saying,
yes,
behavior economics. And if and when someone's in that state, to be able to take a step back and see a big picture can be nearly impossible, it seems, because they're so drawn to that next moment. And this,
right.
yes, this idea of what is it called? Is it openness? Is that what it is? That trait?
Yeah, openness to experience. So one of the
Mm-hmm.
so-called big five personality traits, one of or probably the most prevailing framework in how to, chop up and describe personality. So it's one of the major traits. So openness to experience, often just called openness, kind of
Mm-hmm.
refers to the ability to take differing perspectives,
Mm-hmm.
appreciate the viewpoints of others, the ability to hold what might seem like mutually exclusive perspectives at the same time, to tending to think more of a both and rather than an either or
Yeah.
rigid framework, and
Because those
also
rigid frameworks don't work out well for people. They really don't.
right, right. It's they're just not very functional often. And then an appreciation for aesthetics, so art and beauty, um, all of that stuff, and so that kind of goes along with this openness to
Yeah.
experience dimension.
Now you
So we
talked
have
about,
found that that tends to increase in a number of studies after psychedelics administration, which is, as far as I know, still it's the only example of a validated personality domain that's been
mm,
shifted by a relatively discrete experimental event. So getting older will change personality and major life events, having kids, but something we could schedule for like next Thursday.
yeah, I'm just feeling like I don't like that part. Let's get a little more openness.
Yeah.
Schedule it in.
Yeah, and it's not, it's detectable, but it's sometimes people have a fear that, they're going to come out being completely different and they're going to, you know, I don't want to say that's impossible, but so much of this is dependent on, um, one's intentions and, but there's some extreme things. You can go down the very interesting rabbit hole of the work that the CIA was doing, investigating psychedelics as brainwashing agents and,
I bet
Charles
that was a
Manson
bad
used
time
them.
for some people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're really powerful tools that affect the mind, which is why it's really important to uh, to have a supportive setting. And they're not for everyone. It does seem that people that have either a predisposition or active issues with things like psychosis,
Mm.
schizophrenia, that could destabilize. These psychedelics can destabilize those people.
Oh yeah, don't nobody wants that. I mean, yeah, you don't go on to the clinic at your local mini mart, right? No,
Hmm.
you gotta these you just don't take that from anywhere. You gotta people have to know what they're doing and exactly how and why and the research behind it. So is it like you have to have a more intense mystical type experience for a better outcome, or can you just like, you know, have a chill event?
Yeah, I think the evidence suggests both.
Hmm.
So it's been published a number of times, and first by a group that I was a part of this work that, finding that better therapeutic outcomes with more mystical experience. And by that, it sounds pretty woo-woo, but it is nominally divorced from supernatural beliefs. It can come with or without, any sort of religious or other kind of supernatural belief system. So it really has to do with the type of experience. So having mystical experience means having it, and this goes back to William James, who's very interested and wrote about these mystical experiences, which often occur outside of drug use through traditions like prayer and meditation or fasting, or sometimes out of the blue. But having an experience of oneness,
Mm,
feeling, having a breakdown of that subject object divide, feeling one with the universe, one with fellow human beings, a sense of transcending time and space, a sense of ineffability, that the experience is beyond words, and an overriding positivity to the experience. That kind of encapsulates what we mean by mystical experience. And there are scales that can, not perfect like any subjective effect scale, but fill out a questionnaire after the session and we can kind of quantify how
how many
mystical
purple
type.
dragons did you see? Right.
Right. So it's not purple dragons, but which is another interesting question. But did you have an experience where you felt like one, with
No,
with the
are they
universe?
sitting in a lab? Like, I have no idea how this is done. Is this comfortable? Are they at least how long? Like, what is the scenario in which they are taking their psychedelics?
Yeah, so it's typically, and I've argued it should be done in a very comfortable setting. So yeah, it's in a lab, but a lab is whatever I mean, I've got
I'm in
plenty
a
of friends
lab.
in. Yeah, I've got plenty of friends in the addiction field. Part of their lab is a mock bar that's like really
Mm,
cool and looks really fun to have a drink in, But so it's in a lab, but this is the type of lab with a really nice, comfortable couch they lay on during the experience, and art on the wall, and a nice carpet, and you know, um, yeah, it's a living room like
mhm.
setting. It's
Okay.
made to be, and even my colleagues who have through constraints, they have to run it out of a hospital room. Even in those settings,
Bring in a
most of the
lamp. Jeez.
exactly, cut off the overhead fluorescence, bring in a nice lamp, hang up some artwork,
Yeah.
put up some drapes, just put some sheer fabric over things. And I think part of that is like not only like the surface level, so there's some more colors, but the idea that someone has gone to the very human effort to make they care about your experience and they're making it an inviting experience. And so, yeah, this is done. And I've argued, it should be done in a comfortable setting. Now, there's other work that, when someone's tripping, they're put into an fMRI
Mhm.
and they're doing
Oh God.
cognitive
Oh
tests.
no, no.
Right, right. And so and you design your study around that. So for example, that type of research, which isn't typically the therapeutic research, because you there's a good chance you're not going to have as much of a therapeutic effect when you're doing things like putting someone in a magnet,
Yeah.
which is terribly loud and can induce claustrophobia. And but for those studies, you more because those are typically more about understanding the acute, the experience, what's happening in the brain and what's happening cognitively during the experience. For those types of studies, you tend to get more people that are kind of old pros, connoisseurs. Like they've done
Yeah, this
psychedelics a
sounds
bunch of
cool. Let's
times.
do it. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're like, okay, I'll trip in the lab with you guys. And so the idea is maybe compared to kind of a psychedelically naive person, they're less likely to freak out.
Don't ask Dr. Aaron Clare to trip in your lab. I'm not that person.
Yeah, yeah.
No. So that does it helps though? Like how much does it help?
Um, it can't, nothing works for everyone. And but I would say the most promising data are for the work with cancer distress. So this is
Mm,
people who have substantial anxiety and depression and other symptoms because of their cancer diagnosis. And it's not in the so-called psychiatry Bible, the DSM yet, but it really, I think the evidence is there. It should be its own. It's distinct. It's not the
yeah.
same as, and it's not adjustment disorder, which sometimes we have to find a description in the DSM. It's not really adjustment disorder. You could frame it as that, but it's not just depression and anxiety. I'd argue, one day, whatever, the DSM will incorporate it, but kind of who cares? These are all
It's
descriptions.
just a book.
Yeah, it's just a book. It's just imperfect people trying to come up with names for things. There's value in doing that, but but it seems really really helpful with people who are either terminal or not necessarily terminal, but it's life threatening to really come to terms with this existential anxiety. That's one way to describe this
Yeah.
cluster of symptoms that comes with facing one's own death.
And
And
that's so smart, especially, I mean, it's a little stressful, and how else can your brain process it? Sounds good, and good
Yeah,
results.
theoretically, and we can certainly do more work to kind of validate this description, but theoretically, I view it as sort of an exposure therapy,
Mm,
which we know for anxiety disorders are the most effective. I mean, gosh, treatment of probably simple phobias is, I think, the
yep.
most effective treatment we have through things like systematic desensitization. You afraid of heights? Okay, first let's just sit in our office and like
Yeah.
look at a photo of a bridge, and then we're gonna kind of just come. We're not gonna go over the bridge. We're just gonna drive a mile away and look at the bridge for. And once you're used to each one of these steps, then one day we're gonna very cautiously go up to the edge of the bridge, and then another day we're gonna go over the bridge, and this type of thing. And so those are very effective, and some of the the best behavioral treatments for PTSD are basically exposure therapy, prolonged exposure therapy in a safe setting, talking about the
Mm,
trauma, the events that trigger you. So in some sense, I mean, people can have acutely, they can feel like they're dying,
yeah.
and they can have such a different experience that and they can have this sort of overview effect, um,
Yeah,
looking
no,
at
that
their
makes
life and
sense.
how they're dealing with things, and I would say along with cancer distress, also addiction. So I've done work with tobacco smoking. Some good colleagues have done work with alcohol, what we call now use disorder, used to be called alcoholism, whatever, same thing. And then I recently published with my colleague Peter Hendricks. He led the study at University of Alabama, Birmingham, work with cocaine use disorder, so helping people
Mm,
with cocaine, all using psilocybin, the magic mushroom psychedelic. And it looks really, I mean, you get really high success rates. Again, nothing works for everyone, but so far they look substantially better than certainly most pharmacological, most medications that are used for these disorders. And I mean, particularly for cocaine use disorder, where there is no medication that's been found to work,
mm.
unlike opioid and alcohol and tobacco, where there's medications that help that people should try if they're struggling. Despite hundreds of compounds being studied as medicines over the last 30 years, nothing's been found really effective for cocaine. So that he published that recently, a few months ago. That's really promising
So
work. And
from
depression is the other category. And that's it. It looks good. Probably those other two I would put ahead of it in terms of just how robust
in
the
terms
response.
ahead of depression or ahead of
That addiction treatment and cancer
addiction.
distress are probably a little more reliable. Again, nothing's 100% reliable, but a little more robust in the response. But it helps a lot of people with depression too. And that's kind of the lead indication. If psilocybin is approved as a medication, it's probably going to be for depression first. So there are companies that are serving as drug sponsors that are in phase 3 trials now, multiple companies looking
Yeah,
at
I've heard
depression.
that. There's so much work being done on that, which is very promising. So for me, like from a very English professor by trade, right? So we're going to distill this down to the thesis from very high level non-science. Basically, the magic mushrooms, you go in and it will make you shift your perspective so much that you're like, I can see things differently now, right? Is that
Right. And to
basically?
me, and this is a constant struggle because, you know, yes, it's a medication. You put it in the person, and we know a lot now about what's happening in the brain while one is on the psychedelic. We know less, we know a little bit, but, kind of $1 million question is like, okay, if you're less depressed a month later, how has the brain changed? We know less about that. We're
Uh-huh.
working on that as a field, but, um, I think the most meaningful answer, and these aren't mutually exclusive, do you want to answer with a biological answer? Do you want to answer with a psychological answer? I think at this point, the most meaningful answer is at psychological level. And when it works, it's psychotherapeutic process. And I've done a lot of survey work of people who have taken psychedelics and had positive impacts outside of a therapeutic context. So they're just by themselves, or maybe they just took it at
Hmm.
a party and then they just realize to themselves like, holy cow, why am I still smoking? Or why do I drink too much? Or they overcome some other addictive or other, psychological issue. Doesn't always happen, of course, but sometimes it's surprising it even happens in those settings where there is not the at least the immediate, focused intention and clinical setting. So when it works, when it helps people, it tends to amplify psychotherapeutic process, which is what you were saying. It's like it's an ability to look at yourself from a different perspective. It's a radically different way for the mind to temporarily interact with itself,
Hmm.
to look at one's interface with the world, to kind of
Hmm.
have this kind of zoom out effect. And from that perspective, one can sort of have some, at least subjectively, I think people can come upon some ground truth. So it's not like just like a drug effect. The thing is, and of course, scientifically, I can't say what, at these psychological levels, what ground truth is. But at least for the person, it's not like the next day they say, oh, God, I had this big, realization about, you know, whatever it is, like, oh, with dealing with my cancer, that I'm causing most of my own suffering, and that, yes, I've got to go to my appointments and do my best to treat
Yeah.
this, but I'm
All
also
done.
yeah, I'm preventing myself from living. Like I could actually get out today and plan vacations and do these things I'm not doing. And so when they think about this the next day when it works, it's not like, oh, that was just a drug effect. And oh, it's like having I had a few drinks and I felt less anxiety and stress free, but now I'm back to normal. It's like, no, the next day they're like, my God, that was right. I may have had that realization prompted by this drug, but the truths that I contemplated were real.
Yes.
It
Well,
was more about me than about what psilocybin does. And so that's why I think like when it works, it's people, and you had a good way to put it. It's like this, it's their perspective. It
hmm
can shift their perspective. And so we're very focused on the field of like, what's different in the brain, what's really the mechanism. And yes, there's going to be a biology and we're going to understand more about that. But it's funny because we typically don't ask that question. We know of dozens of very successful psychotherapies for different disorders, everything from cognitive behavioral therapy to motivational enhancement to dialectic behavior therapy to the various exposure therapies we talked about.
hmm
Typically we don't ask like, well, it's how can this person be better 6 months from after the treatment? What's different about the brain? And we have to have a brain explanation for why they're better. And that would be we should do more of that research, and that's very interesting. So I'm not saying that's not an important question, but it's almost like if there's a medication that prompts it in the case of psychedelics, even though you're not taking the medication every day, and that's something that hasn't been mentioned yet.
Yeah.
That's where it's different than other psychiatric medications. You only have one, two, or three sessions.
Yeah. And
Studies
then
differ.
bam, done.
But then we're seeing effects like 6 months or a year later, these positive
Hmm.
effects. So we typically don't ask with the psychotherapy. We don't disbelieve it. Like I'm very skeptical with this, cognitive behavioral therapy, the fact that someone can be less depressed 6 months from now until I see how the brain's different.
Yeah.
And you say, well, they've changed the way they've developed new habits. They've learned that when they find themselves when having these self-defeating thoughts, that they psychologically step back and they think about themselves this way instead, or they go through this exercise, or they center themselves, whatever it is. People actually learn things and how to,
Yeah.
and then when you actually go through the world with those new habits, like they work.
Yeah.
Just like if you go long enough without drinking, eventually it is going to get better. Like you're not going to, the cravings
Yeah.
are going to subside. Maybe they won't disappear, but, and you are going to realize like it's nice not to wake up every day with a hangover. It's nice. I'm not doing the stupid, I'm not impairing my social relationship the way it was. So there's a feed forward when you have a healthier way of interacting with the world is reciprocal.
Yes.
And so it's not that the medication, when you have these psychotherapeutic like improvements, there's a feed forward aspect to it. It's
Hmm.
that ongoing nature that's causing the because the drug's been metabolized within a day.
Yeah, that's
It's
out of
out
you.
of your brain.
Well, here I'm gonna put it how I see it, and this is gonna be ready world. So the goal of all of these things, the behavior, the psychedelics, exposure therapy, and even things like meditation and mindful work, is all leading to a perspective shift. That's the whole
Hmm.
point. It's just
Yeah.
sometimes it's very slow where you're like, now you're going to look at a picture of a snake. Oh, too much, right? And eventually getting to the point where you see your perspectives change. Snakes are fine. I can go live in the world. And shout out to Dr. Kayla Black, exposure therapy for flying. Been through it. Not fun, but it works. So, same thing if the goal of, say, meditation is to get you to really, it's to know yourself and to be able to see your brain and observe it from a distance without responding, which it
Hmm.
sounds like that's exactly the sort of thing that's happening in the psychedelic experiences. They can be outside of their own brains and observe themselves for a little bit and be like, huh, look at you. And that perspective shift happens instead of 5 minutes a day for 30 years or however many rounds of therapy or whatever in a couple sessions. I say it's effective. That is behavioral economics. No, no, it's not.
Sure,
But
sure.
it's
I mean, yeah,
effective.
there's nothing magic about it, you know.
Yeah,
I mean, it's all language. Like helping anyone is magic, you
yeah,
know.
yeah, it is.
You know,
Shifting
but I guess
perspectives magic, really, in a way. It's really hard to do.
right, right. I mean, but there's nothing necessarily supernatural
Yeah.
about. Although interesting, like one of the things that makes psychedelics very interesting is people often have experiences where they and we don't have the answers scientifically, like they have experiences of God or of insights into the ultimate nature of reality, into metaphysics,
Mhm.
and about all these levels that we can't. Is that an actual insight? Have they shifted their mind to be able to perceive some great philosophical metaphysical truths, or is
Or
that
was it a
all
means
active
to an
delusion?
end, right? There's
What
also
what's
is
that?
it, or was it a means to path to get to this better understanding? It's just part of, I
Right.
think it's part of it because you can't shift your experience without something outside of you really being able to look at yourself from some perspective outside of yourself.
Right. Are these useful metaphors, and then you kind of get to the realm of sort of like with a lot of people who are addicted when they're helped with 12 step, they realize they admit that they haven't been able to do it, and they're turning it over to a God of their understanding,
Mhm.
which is kind of a language of your understanding, is a language kind of that was incorporated for folks. Hey, you don't have to believe, you don't have to be traditionally
Yeah.
religious, but just in some way, shape, or form, believe that there is something beyond yourself. You
Yeah.
are not the
Same with
universe.
yoga. There's something
Yeah.
bigger than yourself.
And so an orientation towards that, some type of transcendent reality, which doesn't necessarily have to come with kind of more what you might call supernatural
Mhm.
beliefs of this or that nature. So it's really interesting seeing how people orient in very different ways to these psychedelic experiences depending on their kind of philosophical bent and their religious bent. But maybe these are ways to try to wrap words around things that are ultimately, ineffable, indescribable,
Mhm.
or maybe they're glimpses of a reality. Um, maybe they're means to an end, and it doesn't really matter, and it's true enough at some level. And again, those are the levels where I, one of my pet peeves is that I see a lot of scientists and therapists kind of really filling in the blanks as if they know those answers.
Yeah, no.
And like, as a like I could have my kind of best guess opinion as a person because, all these questions, is it possible? Is life after death possible? It's like
Yeah.
I can't say anything as a scientist that's any more valuable. I can say, like there's never been, as far as I know, repeatable, widely accepted, observable proof of that. But there's plenty of things we eventually realized were real that we didn't have proof of. So
Yeah.
I see a
Yeah,
lot of
and
people
for me,
filling
it's
in the
I
blanks
well, what they're doing is
where,
talking about what's not their field, honestly, because they don't know
right.
enough about it. We don't.
Which I have no problem referring, helping people and supporting them, and you're not correcting them. You're not imposing
Mm,
materialism and say, well, no, you didn't. That wasn't a vision of your ancestors. Like, what do I know? Like, it could have
yeah.
been a vision of their ancestors, but I'm
Yeah.
not going to tell them that was definitely a vision of your ancestors.
Yeah.
Y-
Like,
y-
that's not
y-
my business what that is. Good.
Right, but it's like, hey, they're not doing it. If your ancestor isn't telling you to kill the neighbor's dog or something, like your
Yeah. They're,
clinical
yeah.
flags don't start going up, then it's like, fine, you support the person through whatever
Yeah.
meaningful experience they have. They're not on, it's not my job to validate the metaphysical reality of the experience. They could talk to their, if they're religiously inclined, talk to their religious leader who might have
Yeah.
something to say about it, or they could go read some books on that. And, but I think that's one of the dangers in the field is that we kind of see scientists and therapists kind of stepping into the guru or priest
Oh,
category.
that's icky. That's a icky
And there's a
no-no.
lot of that. And like
Mm-mm.
Tim Leary, if you're familiar with that
Oh,
history, he was the Harvard professor that he was a brilliant man. He did a
yeah.
lot of great, and he it's just wow, like really some fascinating. He wrote these
Yeah.
wild, interesting books, and I think he was on. But he also went that, especially once he was kicked out of academia, he just went wild, and he was very minimally incautious in terms of, I would say overall, really encouraging teenagers to use,
That's
drugs.
not a good idea.
It, yeah, yeah. I mean, and other times he would be, very cautious. He would say things like, "Don't trust me. This stuff can make you go crazy." Like that's what life is about, But if you take any one little snip of what he says, it's like, at least I would say, incautious at
Yeah.
times. But going that kind of guru route that it can really go to your head because oftentimes people will say these sessions were one of the most, if not the most meaningful experience of their life. And that can really go to your head thinking like I'm God's gift to therapy. Like, look at
Yeah.
me.
It
Rather than a
it
humility
was
towards saying, I'm
it
doing
was the
something.
drugs
This is a
too.
very powerful tool. And there are traditions, some of which date back prehistorically. It was, the shamanistic traditions. There's various ways that people have used these compounds. This isn't about you and
Yeah.
you're using
You
a
didn't
very
invent
powerful
it.
technique. Yeah, that's not about you. And hopefully you can support it and safely shepherd people through it and serve a very valuable role and do some scientific studies, if it was working to help show that and help to get approvals to make it more widely available. But, you're not, check yourself when you see someone
Yeah.
wildly
Well, you
improved.
wrote
It's
the
not
what was
your,
it? The safety standards? That
yeah,
paper?
yeah. So that's a part of that, like, yeah, keep people safe, support them, but also, check yourself and, from going, because we've already seen like, therapists sleeping with patients and things like all of this realm of, you're going to see, more of that and more of, you know, charismatic doctors and therapists like fleecing their people out of too much money and having a cult like all of the
Yeah.
cult like stuff can happen
Yeah.
with
Anytime
psychedelics.
something gets cult like, run away. If it becomes about that one person, run away because then it's not
Right.
about
If
the
it's
greater good.
right. If it's about that one person, then just be very cautious.
Yeah.
Um,
Instead, it should be like you're talking about really cool research with potential to help so many people. And actually, I could talk to you about this all day, but we're already at the end of our time. So I just have two questions left for you.
yeah.
One is if you had any advice for anybody listening, what would it be? General topic, well-being, happiness, contentment, all of it. Any advice you'd like to give people?
Okay, thinking beyond my research and just yeah, just boom. Like
Yeah.
eh, patience
Mm,
and I touched on it earlier. Like you're not supposed to be happy all the time. It depends on how you shoot for something more like contentment
yeah.
than happiness. And sometimes the boring old stuff, especially as I don't know, as you rack up the years. I mean, hopefully I have more years to go, but I'm 52, and just some of the things like young folks, they I don't know, there can be the sense that they're the only ones that have ever gone through this
Yeah.
problem, and it's like this all try to take a bigger perspective. And even if you don't know what that is like just try to recognize that, like, hopefully you're going to be around a long time and you're going to look back on this and realize that, maybe even like you'll come to value and to be thankful for some of those, like, why me? Why, whatever it is. Why wasn't I born rich? Why wasn't I born with the best looks? Why was I born a klutz? Or why can't I get a boyfriend or girlfriend? And all of these things that, young people can beat themselves up over. Like, give yourself some time.
Mm,
The world it can be a very wonderful place if you're open
mm,
to it and you can find a lot of happiness, but really patience is key, and having that kind of broader perspective. And it may not come in the form that you, in your infinite wisdom when you were 22 years old, that you thought
yeah.
that it was going to come in.
That is very good advice and very true. If you wait, it does get better.
Yeah, yeah.
It does. And your last question, you get to add a song to the Happy You Asked playlist. Any song in the whole wide world that you would like, that is yours.
Any song in the whole world
Mhm.
to the happiness playlist.
It is all over this playlist, so as it should be.
Oh, I could go so many directions, but maybe so an old Judas Priest song, heading out on the highway. I'm not sure if you've ever listened, but it has that kind of excitement and kind of embracing life, and just sense of adventure, and that things are there waiting for you if you only kind of go out there into the beyond, and are open to finding them. So
I I
yeah,
I
I don't know.
freaking
That's kind of
love that.
random. I could name a million songs.
No,
That's the one that
no,
came to my
it
head. I'm an old
it's so perfect
heavy
that the
metal fan.
psychedelics guy's like Judas Priest.
Yeah, yeah. It's probably going to be that or Iron Maiden. I don't know, or
Yeah,
something.
I
Metallica.
was, I was like,
I
you just
am
been like,
wide in my appreciate. Could have been jazz. It could have
it
been
could have
Jack
been any of
Pastorius. It
anything.
could have been
Judas Priest.
Miles Davis. But yeah, like, could have been an old Waylon Jennings country tune. But yeah, I went with
It's
Judas Priest.
I love it. It's my favorite question because there's always scientists and they're like, Madonna, obviously. What? It's just,
Yeah.
I can't thank you enough. This research
Or
is
it could have
so
been.
important.
You give me thinking about it too much. Could have been Beethoven's Ode to
No, I
Joy,
know. Oh,
Beethoven's
see,
Ninth.
no
I
one's
mean,
even
that's kind
said
of
that.
classic, probably, but
No, no one said it yet. That's still hanging out
really,
there.
I mean, to me, that might be in terms of just,
Yeah, dun
yeah,
dun dun. Yeah,
oh
exactly.
yeah, just so, yeah, goosebumps. Yeah. Anyway, I'll
Dr.
stop there.
Johnson, your research is incredible, and I thank you for it because it's so exciting and can help so many people. Has that potential. So thank you, thank you, thank you for it.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for chatting about it. I
Yes,
appreciate
happiness is my jam. I get to talk to the coolest people.
it. Very cool.
And thank you to everyone for listening, for being here, and until next time, bye bye.